From Bohemia to California via Primrose Hill. Bohemia holds a special place in literary geography. The third scene of the third act of Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale occurs upon the shores of Bohemia. Indeed, the first line makes sure of it. Thou art perfect then, our ship has touched upon the deserts of Bohemia. What is so special about that? Well, let's jump forward by a century and quote Tristram Shandy. And there happening throughout the whole kingdom of Bohemia to be no seaport town whatever. How the deuce should there? Trim, cried my Uncle Toby, for Bohemia being totally inland, it could have happened no otherwise. It might, said Trim, if it had pleased God. Whether or not it pleased God, the fallacious notion that Bohemia isn't landlocked pleased Shakespeare, and Bohemia gained in fiction what it never had in fact. Well, never? Well, almost never. Uncle Toby doesn't seem to know that Bohemia did get a tiny bit of territory on the coast of the Adriatic for a short period in the late 13th century, and again in the early 16th. Shakespeare almost certainly didn't know that Bohemia had ever been anything other than landlocked. Shakespeare didn't give a damn about geography. In The Tempest, Prospero is abducted from his palace in Milan and bundled down to the docks under cover of darkness. 74 miles overnight is a good bit of bundling in the days of the Ferrari. Not that that bothered the bard. He had people sailing from Verona and a sail maker working in Bergamo, an Italian town that's over 100 miles from the nearest port. Writers these days devote their time to research, and Shakespeare devoted his to writing. He set a whole play in Venice, apparently unaware that there were any canals there. At least he never mentions any, and whenever the city pops up he refers to it as a land, even though it's in the sea. Shakespeare seems never to have consulted a map, and anybody who feels too sniffy about that can, like Cleopatra, go and hang themselves from the top of the pyramids. After all, fiction is only fact, absent of time. If the polar ice caps keep melting, the sea will eventually come to Verona, to Milan, and finally to Bergamo. And then the sun will expand, and the earth in a few billion years' time will be parched and burning rock, and the charred bones of Shakespeare, resting in their grave, will be vindicated, because all the canals in Venice will be dry. The poet A.E. Housman took the same attitude with his poem, Hugely Steeple. In a letter to his brother, he wrote, I ascertained, by looking down from Wenlock Edge, that Hugely Church could not have much of a steeple. But as I'd already composed the poem and could not invent another name that sounded so nice, I could only deplore that the church at Hugely should follow the bad example of the church at Brew, which persists in standing on a plain, after Matthew Arnold said, in a poem called The Church at Brow, that it stands among mountains. A French playwright called Alfred de Vigny once wrote a play set in London about the doomed poet Chatterton. Apparently, it's rather a good play if you're French, but any Londoner is bound to snigger when Chatterton's friends set off to hunt wild boar on Primrose Hill, which is a small park in a rather leafy little suburb. However, Primrose Hill does adjoin London Zoo, so it would only take a loose railing or two to render de Vigny right, and Londoners endangered. Under the tutelage of time, nonsense becomes geography. The Greeks believed in a country called Amazonia, filled with fierce female warriors that never existed. Then a couple of thousand years later, an explorer called Francisco de Orellana was attacked by angry women during a voyage up the big South American river, so he called it Amazon. Or take the case of the utterly fictional island of California. California. The first description of California was written in Spain in about 1510, which is odd because at the time no European had been to the western coast of the Americas. but fiction usually beats fact to the punch. The description was written by Garcia Rodriguez de Montalvo, and the reason that he was able to write it with such authority was that California was an entirely fictional place. Montalvo wrote and compiled stories of high and wonderful chivalry. He had knights in gleaming armour, dragons, sorcerers, maids in distress, and wonderful exotic locations that he populated with fantastic creatures. In his fourth book, The Exploits of Esplandian, he invented a strange island that was near the lost Garden of Eden. Montalvo wrote, "Know that on the right hand from the Indies exists an island called California, very close to a side of the earthly paradise, and it was populated by black women, without any man existing there, because they lived in the way of the Amazons. They had beautiful, robust bodies, and were brave and very strong. Their island was the strongest of the world, with its cliffs and rocky shores. Their weapons were golden, and so were the harnesses of the wild beasts that they were accustomed to domesticate and ride, because there was no other metal in the island than gold." This gives you some idea of Montalvo's imagination, and also why the promise of these strong-bodied, sex-starved ladies might have appealed to the lusty Spanish explorers who were sailing off to the New World. We know that Christopher Columbus's son owned a copy of Montalvo's work, and Cortes, the first European to enter the Pacific, referred to it in a letter of 1524. What's more, the place we now call California was thought to be an island at the time. Of course, California was never actually an island, but going to a mistake by an exploratory monk, European mapmakers believed that it was an island from the 16th century up until about 1750. How the explorers got it so wrong is unclear, but as late as 1716, an English geographer was able to write, "California. This island was formerly esteemed a peninsula, but now found to be entirely surrounded by water," which is good enough for me, and it was good enough for the Spaniards who were deciding what to name this temperate paradise. The explorers decided to name it after the magical land of ferocious and attractive women who had appeared in Montalvo's chivalric fantasy. Montalvo called his island California because it was ruled by a beautiful queen called Califia. In the exploits of Esplandian, Califia had been persuaded to bring her army of ferocious and attractive women, plus some trained griffins, to fight alongside Muslims and against Christians at the siege of Constantinople. However, Califia falls in love with Esplandian, is defeated, taken prisoner, and converts to Christianity. Then she returns to the island of California with her Spanish husband and her trained griffins. There are several theories as to why Montalvo chose the name Calafia, but by far the most convincing is that as she was fighting alongside Muslims, her name was chosen to suggest or echo the title of the Muslim leader, the Caliph. So California is really, ultimately, etymologically, the last surviving caliphate. The caliphate, a sometimes factual and sometimes formal union of all Islamic states, was abolished by the Young Turks of Turkey in 1924. Recently there have been strenuous and violent attempts to revive the caliphate by Al-Qaeda. However, if a troop of crack etymologists could be sent into terrorist strongholds, they could gently explain that the caliphate never disappeared. It's alive and well and is in fact the most populous state in America. The hash guys. Even without California complicating the matter, the question of who should be caliph and what counts as a caliphate has been a tricky one ever since the Prophet Muhammad died. The first Khalifa was a fellow called Abu Bakr, who had been one of the first converts to Islam. However, after a few years, some folk decided that it shouldn't have gone to him, and that the position should instead have been handed down to Muhammad's son-in-law, and thence to his grandson, and so on and so forth, from one oldest son to the next. These people were called the Shia. The others were called the Sunni. However, heredity in principle always leads to dispute in practice. And so in 765 AD, when one of the descendants of Muhammad disinherited his eldest son, Ismail, the Shias themselves split in two. There were those who agreed that Ismail should be passed over, and there were those who didn't. These latter were called the Ismailis. The Ismailis did rather well for themselves. They managed in the 9th century to conquer most of North Africa, and they sent out lots of undercover evangelists to the rest of the Islamic world. These evangelists converted people in secret, until there was a huge network of secret Ismailis who were, perhaps, going to help to establish an Ismaili caliphate once and for all. But they didn't, because the Sunnis invaded North Africa, burnt all the Ismaili books, and converted everybody straight back to the first form of Islam at the point of a scimitar. Now all the Sunnis needed to do was to root out the Ismaili converts in their home territory. Everything would be fine and dandy. So, the Ismailis had a hard time of it. They were tracked down and persecuted and fined and put to death and all the other lovely things that mankind likes to do to his neighbour. They couldn't fight the persecution because, though there were a lot of them, they were scattered about here and there, couldn't raise an army. Then an Ismaili called Hassan-i-Sabah had a brilliant idea. He seized one single solitary castle near the Caspian Sea. It wasn't a strategically important castle, as it was at the top of a remote mountain, at the end of a remote mountain valley, in a remote region. But for all these reasons, the castle of Alamut was essentially invincible and unattackable. From this base, Hassan let it be known that if any Ismailis got persecuted, he would respond. Not by fighting the soldiers or taking territory or anything like that. He would simply send one of his disciples out to kill the one man, the senior official, who had ordered the persecution. And what's more, the killing would be done with a golden dagger. And they did. The first chap they killed was the vizier of the caliphate himself. And then they picked people off left, right and centre. Two things, other than the gold dagger, made them utterly terrifying. The first was that they would get into their target's entourage as sleeper agents and prepared to work for years as stable boy or servant just to get close enough to the victim. You could hire bodyguards, but how did you know that the bodyguards weren't killers themselves? The second was that they were quite prepared to suffer death afterwards. Indeed, they saw it as a bit of a bonus. They'd kill their targets and then kill themselves, confident in the promise of paradise. Nobody knew what to make of them, but the general opinion was they were all on hashish. This is almost certainly untrue, but the name stuck. They were the hash guys, or in the colloquial Arabic plural, the hashashin. Religious fervour fades, but gold always gleams. And when the Crusaders arrived in the Middle East, they made contact with the Syrian branch of the Ismailis in a second mountain fortress that was run by the old man of the mountain. The old man agreed to hire out the services of his disciples to the Christian invaders, who were immensely impressed by their fatal fanaticism and discipline. Stories of the Hashashin got back to Europe, where the Arabic H was dropped and the hash guys became the assassins. It wasn't long before assassin had been verbed into assassinate. And then all you needed was William Shakespeare to invent the word assassination for his play Macbeth. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his surcease success. But etymologically speaking, assassination will always be the cannibalization of the victim, or the marijuanification, or the potification, or whatever synonym you want to use for dope. drugs. Dope is a terrible thing and is particularly bad for racehorses. Drug a racehorse just a little bit and you ruin his performance, which is why it's absolutely necessary for a betting man to know in advance which horses have been doped and which are clean living and ready to win. Such a gambler is said to have the dope on a race, the inside knowledge of which runner has gone to pot. Pot itself has nothing to do with pots and pans, but comes from the Mexican-Spanish word potiguaya, which means marijuana leaves. And marijuana is a Mexification of Mary Jane, for reasons that everybody's much too stoned to remember. Another Mexican part of the drug language is reefer, which comes from grifo, a word for a drug addict south of the border. In fact, the vocabulary of drugs is as exotic as their origins. The assassins would, if they didn't smoke hashish, have done so through a hookah. If they smoked hashish, they'd have done so through a hookah, a small pot through which the intoxicating vapours are allowed to bubble. When American troops took up doing the same thing during the Vietnam War, they took the local Thai word for hookah, buang, and turned it into bong. Of course, the terminology of drugs is a matter of dispute, legend, stoned supposition. Nobody's utterly sure whether a joint is something smoked in an opium joint, or whether it's something that's shared and therefore jointly owned. Nor does anybody have any idea why people from the 1920s New Orleans called joints muggles. Whoever invented the word spliff didn't bother to write down why. Dope itself was originally a kind of thick sauce called doop, into which Dutch people would dip pieces of bread. The sense transferred over to drugs only when people started smoking a thick and gloopy preparation of opium. Given that Amsterdam's dope cafes have now become famous throughout the world, it's a little disappointing that any high you might receive from the original Dutch doop would be a placebo effect. Pleasing psalms. Placebo is Latin for I will please, and its origins are not medical but religious. From the beginning of the 19th century, a placebo has been a medical term for a medicine adapted more to please than to benefit the patient. Before this, a placebo was any commonplace cure that could be dreamt up by a barely qualified medic. The point was not that the pill would please, but that the doctor would please. For long before placebo medicines, there was Dr. Placebo. In 1697, a doctor called Robert Pierce recalled, rather bitterly, how he was always being beaten to new business by a charming and talentless medic whose name he was either too polite or too scared to write down. He called him instead Dr. Placebo, and noted with tragic jealousy that Placebo's wig was deeper than mine by 2 curls. Whoever the original Dr. Placebo was, his nickname was taken up by various other embittered doctors in the 18th century until placebo doctors had given placebo pills with placebo effects. At this point, things get a little misty, because although placebo does mean I will please, the word was originally associated not with cures, but with funerals. There's nothing so much fun as a good funeral, and anybody who's truly fond of a good party will tell you that the death rate is much too low, even though it adds up to 100% in the end. The drink doled out at a wake has a certain morbid lavishness to it that is rarely or never found at christenings. People probably still do turn up at the funerals of those they never knew just in order to get their hands on some booze, but the practice was much more common in medieval times. People would put on their best clothes and turn up to the funerals of the rich, taking part in the service in the hope of joining in the wake. This meant that they'd all stand silent while the first 9 verses of Psalm 114 was sung. Then, as it was an antiphon, and as they all wanted to seem particularly enthusiastic about the deceased, they'd usually lustily sing the 9th verse back to the presiding priest. Placido Domino in regione vivorum, which means, I will please the Lord in the land of the living. In the Ironbite of Inwit, the prick of conscience, from the mid-14th century, the author observes that the worst flattery is that one that singeth placebo. Chaucer chimes in by saying that flatterers are the devil's chaplains that singeth ever placebo. So the psalm led to the funeral, which led to the flatterers, which led to the flattering doctors, which led to the placebo pill. Now this may all seem rather unlikely, and some etymologists are more inclined to go straight to the Latin I will please, but the psalms were much more important in the Middle Ages than they are today. And they've given us all sorts of words that we might not expect. Memento became famous because it was the first word of Psalm 131. Memento Domine David et omnis mansuetudinis eius. Lord, remember David and all his afflictions. Even more obscure is the connection between the Psalms and the phrase to pony up or pay. Consider that 25th of March is the end of the first quarter of the year and was thus the first payday for those who are paid quarterly. 25th of March was therefore a good day for everybody except employers. Nobody likes them anyway. People would wake up on the 25th of March, toddle along to church for matins, sing the psalm with avaricious expectation in their heart. The psalm for that day is the 5th division of Psalm 119, which is the longest psalm in the Bible and needs to be broken up into bite-sized chunks. The 5th division begins with the words, Legem pone mihi Domine, viam justificationem tuarum et exquiram eam semper, which means, teach me, O Lord, the way of thy statutes, and I shall keep it unto the end. Legem pone, therefore, became a slang word for the down payment, because in the psalm-obsessed medieval mind, it was the first two words of payday, legem pone. In the centuries since then, the legem has been dropped, but that doesn't mean the phrase has disappeared. If you've ever asked anybody to pony up, it's only a corruption of legem pone and a reference to the praises of pay. Biblical errors. Some people say that the Bible is the revealed word of God, which would imply that God spoke English. There's even a society in America that believes that the King James Version was given to mankind by divine revelation. And it has a big ceremony once a year in which other versions of the Bible are piled up and burned. It's certainly true that the King James Version was a lot more accurate than Miles Coverdale's attempt of 100 years before. Miles Coverdale was an early Protestant who believed in principle that the Bible should be translated into English. He decided that as nobody else seemed to be doing it, he'd better get on with the job himself. He didn't let the tiny detail that he knew no Latin, Greek or Hebrew get in his way. This is the kind of can-do attitude that's sadly lacking in modern biblical scholarship. Coverdale did know a bit of German though, and the Germans who had invented Protestantism had already started preparing their own translation. Coverdale threw himself into his work and produced a psalter that is still used in Church of England services today. It is, though, much more beautiful than it is accurate. For example, he has the line, "The strange children shall fail and be afraid out of their prisons." It's beautiful and mysterious. Who are the strange children? What's so strange about them? And what on earth are they doing in prison? The answer is that the line should be translated as, "The foreign-born shall obey and come trembling from their strongholds." But the best of Coverdale's mistranslations is about Joseph, whose neck, we're told in Psalm 105, was bound in iron. The problem is that Hebrew uses the same word for neck as it does for soul. The word is nephesh, and it usually means neck or throat, but it can mean breath because you breathe through your neck, and it can also mean soul because the soul is the breath of life. You have the same thing in Latin and English with spirit and respiratory. If Coverdale had made only one mistake, English would have been given the phrase, his soul was put in iron. But Coverdale was never a man to make one mistake when two would do, so he mixed up the subject and the object and came up with the wonderfully inappropriate and nonsensical, the iron entered into his soul. And yet somehow that phrase works. It may have nothing to do with the original Hebrew, but Coverdale's phrase was so arresting that it caught on. Nobody cared that it was a mistranslation. It sounded good. Even if the translation of the Bible gets it right, English speakers can still get it wrong. Strait, these days, is usually used to describe a narrow stretch of water like the Bering Straits or the Straits of Gibraltar. But if you think about it, other things can be straight. Straitjackets are small jackets used to tie up lunatics. People who are too tightly laced up are straight-laced. If a gate is hard to get through, then it is a straight gate. And the hardest gate to pass through is the gate that leads to heaven. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. Which is not why it's the straight and narrow, but the straight and narrow. Finally, the salt of the earth, a biblical phrase that has managed to almost reverse its meaning. These days, the salt of the earth are common folk, the working men and women, the ordinary Joes on the Clapham omnibus. But if that were the case, the earth would be much too salty to taste good. When Jesus invented the phrase, the salt of the earth, he meant exactly the opposite. The world was filled with sinners and pagans, and the only reason that God didn't destroy it utterly was that the few people who believed in him were like salt to earth's stew. Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt hath lost its savour, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out, and to be trodden under the foot of men. This is strange, as Jesus was later crucified by a bunch of Roman salt men. Salt. Nobody's certain where the word soldier comes from, but the best guess is that it has to do with salt. Salt was infinitely more valuable in the ancient world than it is today. To the Romans, salt was white, tasty gold. Legionnaires were given a special stipend just to buy themselves salt and make their food bearable. This was called the salarium, and it's where we get the English word salary, which is really just salt money. Roman writer Pliny the Elder therefore went so far as to theorize that soldier itself derived from saldare, meaning to give salt. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with this theory, but as Pliny the Elder was a little bit of a nut job, it should have probably be taken with a pinch of salt. Like the salt of the earth, it makes something easier to swallow. Mainly though, salt is not military, but culinary. Salt gets into almost every food and into an awful lot of food words. The Romans put salt into every single one of their sauces and called them salsa. The old French dropped the L and made this sauce. They did the same with Roman salsicus, or salted meat, and that turned into saucisse, and then into sausages. The Italians and Spanish kept the L and still make salami, which they can dip into salsa. And the Spanish then invented a saucy dance of the same name. So necessary is salt to a good meal that we usually put it on the table twice. The old French used to make do with a salier, or salt box, on the table at meal times. The English, who are always trying to work out how the French make such delicious food, stole the invention and took it back home. However, once the salier had been removed from France, people quickly forgot the word's origin and how it should be spelt. So we ended up changing salier to cellar. Then, just to be clear what was in the cellar, we added salt onto the beginning and called it a salt cellar, which is etymologically a salt salier or salt salter. The Romans would have used a salter to season their vegetables and make herba salata, which we've had since shortened to salad. And this brings us to a strangely salty coincidence involving the good old days. In Antony and Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen talks of her salad days, when I was green in judgment. And the phrase has now taken up residence in the language. We use salad days as a synonym for halcyon days, which by an odd coincidence also means salty days. Halcyon days. People talk nostalgically of the halcyon days. They hanker and pine, and in the midst of their hankering they ask if we shall ever see such halcyon days again. And we shall. The halcyon days begin each year on 14th of December and last until the 28th, and like the salad days they are etymologically very salty. This time the salt is Greek, and so the prefix we're looking for is hal. And the same hal, in fact, that you find in the salt-producing chemicals known as halogens. Indeed, halcyon and halogen are etymologically almost identical. The one gives birth to salt, and the other is a salty conception. That's because halcyon is another word for the kingfisher, and kingfishers lay their eggs at sea. For a full and accurate explanation of all this, we shall have to turn to the Roman poet Ovid, who explained it all in his Metamorphoses. Once upon a time, there was a boy called Cakes and a girl called Halcyon, who fell madly in love. Unfortunately, Cakes had to go away to sea, and Halcyon would wait for him every day on the beach, gazing at the horizon and longing for her lover's return. Halcyon continued this vigil until she was informed by the utterly reliable medium of a dream that Cakes' ship had sunk and he had been drowned. At this news she got so upset that she fell ill and died a couple of days later. Or as Chaucer put it in one of his most beautiful couplets, "Alas, she said for very sorrow, and died within the thrid a morrow." Everybody was very upset by the whole business, including the gods, who got together and decided that the least they could do for the poor couple was to turn them into birds. So Cakes and Halcyon were raised from the dead, covered in feathers, and that's where kingfishers come from. Because Halcyon had spent so long gazing out to sea, that's where she now lays her eggs, in a little floating nest. And just to make sure she's not disturbed, the gods have arranged that the winds should be light during her nesting season, which lasts through the second half of December. This fortnight of good weather is therefore known as the Halcyon days. Of course, modern biologists scoff at Ovid's story and dismiss it purely on the basis that it isn't true. However, poetry is much more important than truth. And if you don't believe that, try using the two methods to get laid. Dog days. The dog days, like the halcyon ones, are a precisely defined part of the year, or at least they were once. The second brightest star in the sky after the sun is Sirius, the dog star, so called because it's the largest star in the great dog constellation, Canis Major. However, during the height of the summer, you can't see the dog star because it rises and sets at the same time as the sun. The ancient Greeks worked out that this happened from 24th of July to 24th of August, and they noticed that this was also the most unpleasantly hot time of the year, so they quite logically decided that it must be the combined rays of the sun and the dog star that were causing the trouble. They also thought a lot about how to cool down. The ancient Greek writer Hesiod has this advice: "In the season of wearisome heat, when goats are plumpest and wine sweetest, women are most wanton, but men are feeblest, because Sirius parches head and knees, and the skin is dry through heat. But at that time let me have a shady rock and wine of Byblis, a clot of curds and milk of drained goats, with the flesh of a heifer fed in the woods that has never calmed, and of firstling kids. Then also let me drink bright wine, sitting in the shade, when my heart is satisfied with food, and so turning my head to face the fresh zephyr from the ever-flowing spring, which pours down unfouled, Thrice pour an offering of water, but make a fourth libation of wine. It's worthwhile memorising that passage and reciting it to a waiter on the first of the dog days. However, you must be careful, as owing to the precession of the equinoxes, the dog days have slowly shifted over the last 2,000 years and now begin around the 6th of July, although it depends on your latitude. None of this has anything whatsoever to do with the notion that every dog will have his day, which comes from Hamlet. Let Hercules himself do what he may, that cat will mew and dog will have his day. We call it the dog star. The Romans called it canicula, meaning dog, and the Greeks called it Sirius, which meant scorching because of the heat of the dog days. However, the Greeks also sometimes referred to it as Scion, the dog. And the star that rises just before Sirius is still called Procyon. And that same Greek word for dog, Scion, also gave the English language the word cynic. Cynical dogs. The Cynics were a school of ancient Greek philosophy, founded by Antisthenes and made famous by his pupil Diogenes. Diogenes was by any standards an odd chap. He lived in a barrel in the marketplace in Athens and used to carry a lamp about in broad daylight, explaining that he was trying to find an honest man. His one worldly possession was a mug that he used for drinking. And then one day he saw a peasant scooping up water with his hands and immediately threw his mug away. Accounts of his death vary, but one story is that he held his breath. Cynic means dog-like. But why was Diogenes' school known as the Dogs? There was a gymnasium near Athens for those who were not of pure Athenian blood. A gymnasium in ancient Greek wasn't exactly the same thing as a gymnasium today. For starters, it was an open-air affair. It was more of a leafy glade than a building filled with parallel bars or rubber mats. People did do their physical training at the gymnasium. In fact, they did it naked. The word gymnasium comes from the Greek gymnasein, meaning to train in the nude, which itself comes from gymnos, meaning naked. But if you could take your mind off the naked boys, which many Greek philosophers found difficult, gymnasiums were also places for socializing and debating and teaching philosophy. Diogenes' gymnasium was known as the Gymnasium of the White Dog of Cynosarge, because a white dog had once defiled a sacrifice there by running away with a bit of meat. Diogenes, not being a native Athenian, was forced to teach in the Dogs' Gymnasium, which is how one hungry and ownerless canine gave his name to a whole philosophical movement. A fun little result of this is that any cynical female is, etymologically speaking, a bitch. Greek, education, and fast child. If cynics are dogs, the Stoics were the porch philosophers, because their founder Zeno taught in the painted porch of Stoa Poikile of the Great Hall of Athens. If you didn't like either the Stoics or the Cynics, you could go out to a grove that was named after a hero of the Trojan War called Academos. It was in the grove of Academia that Plato taught, and all the academics since are named after it, which means that the Police Academy films are all named after a hero of the Trojan War via Plato. The Athenians, as you can tell, were jolly philosophical chaps. This was largely because they had a wonderful education system in which the Greek children, or pedos, were taken through the whole cycle, or cyclos, of learning. Their knowledge was therefore encyclopedic. The Romans were so impressed with the way Greek children were taught all these different subjects that they started writing books called encyclopedias that were meant to contain articles on every topic there was. Then, 2,000 years later, the internet was invented. The internet works on computers, and computers work on all sorts of different programming languages. These programming languages tend to be rather complicated things that are hard to learn, and even for initiates, slow to use. So in 1994, a chap called Ward Cunningham developed a system of making related web pages that would be very simple and very fast. Because it was so quick, he called it WikiWikiWeb, because wiki is Hawaiian for fast. And the reduplication WikiWiki therefore means very fast indeed. Soon though, people decided that WikiWiki was a bit of a mouthful, so it was colloquially shortened to Wiki. And that was the state in which Larry Sanger found the word in 2001, when he had the idea of a collaborative web-based encyclopedia that would use the wiki system. He took the words wiki and encyclopedia and mashed them together to form Wikipedia, which is now the 7th most visited website in the world. However, few among its 365 million readers know that Wikipedia means fast child. Fewer still will have considered the fact that anyone who likes Wikipedia is technically and etymologically a Wikipedophile. Cybermen. These days, if you aren't wiki or cyber or virtual, you are nothing. You might as well give up and make do with real life, which mankind has been trying for thousands of years without success. Cyberspace is out of control and filled with cyber squatters having cyber sex with cyber punks. And this would make more sense if anybody actually knew what cyber meant. The answer may come as a shock to cyberpunks, because cyber means controlled. Indeed, it comes from the same root as governed. Back in the 1940s, there was a man called Norbert Wiener who was studying how animals and machines communicated with and controlled each other. He decided to call his field of study cybernetics, after the Greek word for steersman. A steersman controls the boat that he's in. In Greek, he cybernans it. From this, the Romans got the idea that a governor who steers the ship of state guberans it. Even though the B has been replaced by a V in the modern governor, as opposed to gubernar, things that belong to the governor are still gubernatorial. Meanwhile, punk was an early 20th century American term for homosexual, specifically the young and pliable companion of an elderly and implacable hobo. From there, punk turned into a generalised insult, and then was taken as a badge of honour by the Nazi rockers in the 1970s. However, an entomologist can still look at the term cyberpunk and wonder what those well-governed homosexuals are up to. Another word that was switched its meaning entirely is virtual. Virtual reality, in case you didn't know, is reality that isn't real. It's virtually real. Though that's not much better than being virtually pregnant. But what really bothers the etymologist is that very few things that happen in virtual reality are in the slightest bit virtuous. If one thing is virtually another, it's because it shares the same virtues. Of course, virtues here don't have to be moral virtues, they can be physical ones. If I'm virtually asleep, then I'm not asleep but possess the same physical virtues as somebody who is. A virtue doesn't have to be good. A virtuoso torturer isn't a good man, but he's just good at his job. It's the sense of virtue that survives in the phrase, by virtue of. Even though you can now achieve things by virtue of dishonesty, virtue used to be a much better thing. Courage, strength, honesty and generosity all used to be virtues. Although a few of these survive in virtual reality. In the ancient world, a virtue was anything that was commendable in a person. Well, I say person, but I mean man. Women can't be virtuous. A virtue is that which is proper to a man. The Latin for man was vir, and virtus was a Latin word for manliness. Virtue is basically the same thing as virility. So if a woman were to be virtuous, she'd become a man-woman, which is a terrible idea. The woman might be so bold as to have her own opinions. She might even express them, at which point she had become a virago. To be fair, virago was originally a word for a heroic woman, but that's still rather sexist, as it implies that heroism is a purely manly quality. In fact, language is irredeemably sexist, but that's not my fault, it's the Romans. Look at their attitude to women in the workplace. Turning tricks. Meretricious is an odd little word that lots of people get wrong. Sounds a little like merit. And as merit is a good thing, you'd take a guess that meretricious means, well, meritable. But it doesn't. Meretricious means showy, gaudy and contemptible. However, the merit in meretricious is the same Latin root that you find in merit. The only difference is that it's women who are doing the meriting. When the Romans wanted to point out that somebody was female, they would put a trix on the end of the word. It's a habit that's largely died out, but you still find it occasionally. A female aviator is sometimes an aviatrix. A female editor can be an editrix, and a lady who is paid to dominate men is a dominatrix. There used to be more trixes. A tonstrix was a female hairdresser, but they slowly died out. Back in ancient Rome, though, they didn't like women having jobs at all. In fact, almost the only women who had jobs in Rome were the women who stood in front of brothels looking for customers. The Latin for standing in front of things is prostitutio. It's a way of earning a living, almost the only one for a girl, and the Latin for earning was merere. When a man earned a living, he merited it, and it became meritable. A veteran soldier who had retired to spend his money could proudly call himself emeritus, which meant that he had earned all he needed and retired, which is where we get emeritus professors. But that's because a soldier was a man. When a girl earned a living, she was a meretrix. And meretrix could mean only one thing, tart. And that's why meretricious still means tarty.